back when I got into it, it was over 20 years ago at Duke University. I never encountered it.
What years were, not to date you or anything, I'm just curious if you were there at the same time as Tucker Max, because he was there like in the late 90s, right?
Yeah, I was there in the late 90s. I graduated in 2000.
I think there might be some overlap. So you two
I was in the women's studies dorm, so if he wasn't there, I probably didn't know him.
I'm pretty sure that the guy who wrote "I Hope They Serve Beer in Hell" was not in the women's studies dorm, unless he was there for horrible purposes. Yeah. So, anyways, continue.
Well, fortunately back then it wasn't in kindergarten through 12th grade, so I didn't encounter it until college. And the way that it's operating today, now that social justice has become so culturally dominant, I'm terrified for kids who are picking it up in elementary school, because it took me 20 years to get out of it. And that was picking up later in life. But yeah, so the way that I got into it was sort of, as I said, by degrees. It presents itself as liberalism. And it's a belief system, although I didn't realize it at the time that it was a belief system. And it's sort of, I think it offers people a system of morality, even though it's very hypocritical, it contradicts itself. But it's like, this is the way to be in the world. The world is about different groups of people who are divided by identity, fighting for power. And we can make the world a better place if we understand these systems of oppression and we redistribute power according to people's identity.
So Marxism then.
Basically, cool. but about identity and power instead of class and wealth.
I mean, it's just Marxism through the prism of Foucault, right? I mean,
yeah, I think I do often describe it that way, as sort of as other people do, a marriage between postmodernism and Marxism. But there are some Marxists who get hung up on the fact that it's not about class, and they'll be like, "Oh, it's not Marxism." I'm like, no, I get that. It's sort of mutated. It's something a little different. It's about power and identity. But no, I got into it because what they kind of do is they're like, hey, have you noticed, like I went in through the feminism door. There's lots of doors. There's the race door, the LGBT door, the fat door, the mental health door.
Is that really people are getting activated because they want to protect the right of people to eat themselves to death without being scrutinized for it?
Oh yes, that's since been sucked up under the umbrella of social justice. So you'll see, I'm sure you've seen online people talking about fat positivity and and you're oppressed if you're fat, and the danger with pulling I think weight into it and pulling mental health into it is that you're now telling all these people who are buying into this belief system that being fat is part of their identity, or having depression is part of their identity, or having a personality disorder is part of their identity, which means that they think of that's like who they are. So there's not an incentive to change those things. In fact, there's a disincentive to change it, because if you look at Lizzo, I think she got mobbed for posting a picture of herself drinking a smoothie. Yeah,
it's internalized fat phobia is how they would refer to that.
That's what they'll call it. Yeah,
that is the dumbest shit I've ever heard in my life.
Yeah.
But yeah, whatever.
But yeah, so I got pulled in through the feminist work, and basically they're like, well, have you ever experienced sexism? And well, yeah, I'm sure I have a few times, and then they kind of by degrees, it's like, okay, well, sexism is in every interaction. It's you need to put on these glasses, go out into the world. These glasses that help you find the sexism in everything and find the racism in everything. And so then you're once you've accepted that one part of it, and they're like, race is the same way. And by the way, we're going to redefine some words for you. They do that right up front. And I think that's really important, because they sort of cut off your ability to think by controlling the language, controlling what words you're allowed to say and what words mean. And so they'll tell you, sexism and racism don't mean what you think they mean. They mean prejudice plus power.
Right. Yeah. The confluence of prejudice and power. That's some kid from that I worked with in politics in Wisconsin, like back in 2012, said that to me, and I'm like, no. You may be referring to systemic, the concept of systemic racism is what you're saying, but don't redefine words, because you're creating an argument at that point. that need not exist at all.
You're exactly right.
It's so fucking stupid.
When anybody says that, if I ask them to define it, okay, well, you give me your definition of racism, and they're like, well, it's systemic. We have to redefine it because we're talking about systemic racism. I'm like, but there's already a term for systemic racism. It's systemic racism. Like what you're doing by changing the definition of racism to say that it's dependent on a person's race, well, then you're basically saying it's impossible to be racist towards white people, or it's impossible to be sexist towards men.
Or Jews now, by the way, because they're white, according to the left. This was late 2020, when God damn it, I think it was the Washington Post ran a story. Are Jews now considered white people or something like that? Like, oh boy, I mean, I guess
they're doing the same thing with Asians. So,
so
they'll again, it's hypocritical, and it's contradictory. Like, they'll claim Asians as people of color when it suits their purposes, but then when it doesn't suit their purposes, when it comes to things like test scores and meritocracy and admission rates to universities, then they'll say, well, Asians are white adjacent. They benefit from white privilege.
What is white adjacent? Exactly. Nobody knows.
I think it's off-white, kind of like a wall color.
Eggshell?
Yeah,
exactly.
it's my cabinets are white adjacent.
I understand. That's weird. Probably racist. Who knows? I don't know. Sometimes it is really funny. Like when Larry Elder was called the black face of white supremacy, that's one of the funniest things I've ever, because somebody should do an analysis just on that sentence and what's necessary for the person to believe to have said it. Just unpack that whole statement, because it's really fucking funny to me.
Yeah.
I mean, it's stupid, but it's like you have to believe that that whiteness it has nothing to do with your nationality or race or culture, any of that shit. It's whether or not you're on the right side of history. You know what I mean? And we have a word for that already. It's authoritarianism, right? Yeah. Like, you don't need the march towards trying to conflate whiteness with authoritarianism. That was the point, right? They could have just said authoritarianism, we're against this and this and this, and everybody would have agreed. Mm-hmm. But it's not a wedge issue at that point. Like, there's no, if you say something that everybody agrees with, nothing really happens. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, you don't continue to get charity donations that you can buy houses with.
Yeah. Well, they use race, they use all these different categories of identity to hide what they're really about, which is, that's what you just pointed out, is race in the end doesn't actually matter to them. It's a tool. So if a black person doesn't agree with the ideology, but a white person does, they're going to let the white person speak. They don't even follow their own rules when they're like, white people need to shut up and sit down and listen. Well, they don't mean that. If you're a white person who speaks the beliefs, you can continue to speak. But if you're a black person like Terrence K. Williams or Candace Owens or Larry Elder, who doesn't speak the belief system, then they want you to shut up.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And now you're starting to see a lot of it from the gender thing as well.
Yes.
I don't remember who it was. People maybe, or Slate or Atlantic. It was some, not like major newspaper, but a pretty serious publication ran a story about how trans women can teach women about femininity, right?
Okay.
First of all, trans woman, that's not a thing in my opinion. That's not a thing. That's a dude. I'm tired of participating in everybody's fucking delusions, frankly. I know people have, excuse me, mixed feelings on this, but if I keep hearing phrases like biological male or female penis, like as soon as somebody says that, then I'm not listening to anything else they have to say, frankly, because I think that's fucking stupid.
Well, what they've done is, again, they kind of go in and they seize on these different categories of identity. They claim that group as their own. They claim to speak for that group. And in the case of trans people, it's like historically there's been a small percentage of a fraction of 1% of people who've grappled with gender dysphoria and feeling like they are so-called trapped in the wrong body.
Right.
And it's been like 0.2%. It's something very small. They've now exploded that into, I think the last stat I read was there's been a 4,000% increase in the number of young people who are identifying as trans.
Well, you broaden the definition, right?
Yes.
And then it's a bigger bucket of people to fight against whatever you're trying to fight
And
against.
if you talk to any of those OG trans people, they're not on board with this shit.
No.
Like, they're like, this is bad for me because now everybody, and I've seen it, they're like getting lumped in with all of these trans trenders and with the people who want to trans kids and push it, in kindergarten. And it's like, I interviewed Buck Angel once. Do you know who he is? I do call him he. I basically, for me, I determine if I use a person's preferred pronouns or not. It's based on whether or not I think they're trying to force me to. Also, it's based on what comes naturally to me. If they've successfully are passing, and it just in my brain says he. When I look at Buck, I say he. And it also has to do with whether or not they're making up words. I don't use they or them or any of those Z and zer and all that stuff. But I interviewed Buck, and they call him Trampa. He was like the first person in California who, biological woman, I know what you just said, but woman who decided to live as a man and went through gender reassignment surgery, was the first person in California to do that. And he's one of the loudest voices against all of this trans trending and against transing kids, because he's like, I'm getting lumped in, and I don't want to speak for him, but they're getting lumped in with this huge explosion in, honestly, I think a lot of it is a social contagion.
Yeah, a little bit.
It's sort of like, do you remember, I don't want to age you, but do you remember the explosion in anorexia and cutting and all that stuff in the 90s and the aughts? It became a big thing. This is what's happening with kids now, is it's sort of everybody and their friends. It's like, oh, and I'm trans and that person's trans and genderqueer and we're all.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty effective strategy. You don't necessarily have to convince anybody of anything. You just start redefining terms, right? Like you talked about morality earlier, in the absence of organized religion that's happened through our generation specifically, and then forward, we didn't find a suitable replacement for that. And these fucking vultures took advantage. That's what happened. It's a power vacuum. And that's not an advertisement for organized religion, by the way. I don't give a fuck about any of that stuff. But people need purpose and principles to guide their lives, right? You need guardrails in life, a purpose.